The most important lesson is that we're near the end of our development of society, which has been going on for about 2,000 years. That we've reached levels of prosperity which carry the seeds of disruption and necessitate a complete relook at the whole world's social, political, and other situations.
It's telling us that the world is in a completely unstable situation and is likely to fall to pieces if it doesn't stop growing.
Let's put it bluntly. Our option is not between this kind of society, present society, and a stable state society. It is between a stable state society and chaos.
Population now doubles in 30 years. Man now uses twice as much energy as he did 15 years ago, and industrial production has nearly trebled in the last 15 years.
During this program, men on the Earth will consume 200,000 tons of petroleum and 200,000 tons of coal, produce 2,000 motor cars, and use 400 million kilowatts of electricity.
If we use known stocks at present rates, there will be no copper left in 2008, no zinc in 1995, no tin in 1989, and no mercury in 1985. There will be no silver, without which we cannot make films, in 1987.
Today we consume more than yesterday. Our children, if they live as we do, will use up resources more than twice as fast as we do.
Our grandchildren might need twice as much oil as we found in Alaska just to meet their increased needs for 1 year.
Such growth threatens to use up all the resources the Earth has to offer us. Such are the enormous needs of the industrial society in progress.
The Industrial Revolution has consumed vast quantities of fossil fuels, for example, and now there aren't many left. And it's as simple as that. If you have a kind of society which is going to eat the very planet we're on, eat it up, consume it, you will find that there's nothing left.
What we're really being told is that although nobody knows for sure exactly when it will happen or exactly what risk is the greatest risk man faces, scientists are fairly unanimous in saying that man does face extremely important risks.
When global population is doubling every 33 years, when resource consumption is doubling every 20 years, no long-term view of mankind can proceed without first forming some preliminary answers to these questions.
Professor Dennis Meadows, at a conference in Washington to mark the publication of his team study for the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth. It concludes that economic growth always generates a crisis, that the road to riches is the road to disaster.
They used the computer to see what would happen if man successfully tackled his obvious problems, if he grew more food, found more natural resources, and controlled pollution.
But first they ran the computer to see what direction the world would take if it ran its present course.
As the century unfolds, industry grows, as does food production and population. But we're using up all our raw materials, the limited metals and fuel in the earth. These run out. Without fuel and metals for the factories, industry collapses. Farming has become highly mechanized, and without petrol and electricity, food production falls too. There's no food and massive unemployment, so the population falls. People are dying. Dennis Meadows explains.
Because of the high population levels and the increasing industrialization, natural resources are depleted at an increasing rate, and finally they fall down to the point where the industrial system can no longer be sustained.
What might this mean in human terms to the average Western family? Over 50 years or more, we get richer. We consume more and more resources. Things like gas and electricity. When essential raw materials like oil and copper run out, civilized life ends.
If we go on as we are, society collapses because we run out of metals and fuel. growth is halted by a resource crisis. So resources still run down slowly. Industry can expand. Pollution, now controlled, doesn't become a problem. Growth is progressing. But this time the population grows so large that food becomes a problem. Food production cannot keep pace with population. People starve. And industrial society collapses.
In this case, the land resources become insufficient, pressure on the land begins to lead to land deterioration, and finally food per capita collapses and brings about a population decline.
This time, the problem is food. Growth provides us with increasing wealth, but as the population grows, food becomes more and more expensive. The growing food shortage turns slowly to famine.
So if growth is not halted by pollution or a resource shortage, it is halted by a food crisis.
But there could be a solution to that too, the Green Revolution. Scientists have been able to double and even treble yields. We can grow more food.
The runs illustrate very succinctly that pollution, natural resource depletion are not problems themselves. The problem is growth in a finite world. So long as we ignore that fact and rely on growth over the short term to solve our problems, overshoot and collapse of the form which we see in the world model seems to us to be absolutely inevitable.
Famine, pollution, and scarcity are not really problems. They are symptoms. Symptoms of growth.
But what about population? Was instability due to the pressures of population growth? A population that doubles every 30 years, that adds 70 million extra human beings to the planet every year?
Well, I think the study makes an important contribution to the environmental dialogue. It points up some of the fundamental issues that man is going to have to grapple with if he's going to survive and continue to improve his position on this planet.
The computer does not predict. It sketches the direction in which our world is moving. It clarifies some of the conflicts between the natural and the man-made world. Nature is balance. Tamper with one part of it, and the complex and unexpected will turn up in another part. That is what the study shows.
The world is running out of many things that it needs. Fossil fuel, for example, is the classic example. But food. We are very, very short of food, and we have 2/3 of the world undernourished to prove it. The problems are overwhelmingly bad. I would go so far as to say that the troubles we see are all part of this business of an overloaded society that doesn't know how to conduct itself any longer. These are all symptoms of what Meadows is talking about, in my opinion. They're symptoms of instability, and that is what Meadows' model is telling us.
If one looks at the whole world, it is becoming better cultivated and more fully peopled than anciently. All places are now accessible, all open to commerce. And where once were hardly solitary cottages, are now large cities. What most frequently meets our view is our teeming population. Our numbers are burdensome to the world, whilst nature fails in affording us her usual sustenance. Our wants grow more and more keen, and our complaints more bitter in all mouths. In every deed, pestilence, famine, and wars have to be regarded as a remedy for nations, as a means of pruning the luxuriance of the human race.
Those words were an eyewitness report made during the decline of the Roman Empire.
The Dark Ages followed. If this study is right, then our society is threatened. No one knows when or how, but if it does mirror the world, If we can see in our problems the stresses of growth, then the world is unstable. Growth, it seems, has an awful logic.
We're not talking so much about certainties as about risks which no modern society really should be willing to bear. It's almost as though one were playing Russian roulette and there were a 20-chamber gun with 5 different kinds of bullets. One question could be, what kind of bullet is it that's going to get you? It seems to me a more appropriate question is, do we even want to play Russian roulette?
Is there an alternative to Russian roulette? Is it possible to produce a stable world? Were there policies which would create equilibrium, a balanced world? They found that if you controlled everything, including industrial production, no crisis emerged. But this assumes that we will stop getting richer.
Population was stabilized by effective birth control from 1975. Food production is stabilized using modern techniques at a high level. The key factor, industrial growth, was leveled off in 1975 too, enabling pollution, also carefully controlled, to be kept within bounds. Resources carefully used are falling gradually.
When these are implemented in 1970, we see that the world system is capable of moving into an equilibrium society, a stable state system, which can be sustained as long as we analyze it through the computer.
What is being suggested is that the only way to ensure the future for our grandchildren is to stop getting richer. Only then will there be the resources and the unpolluted world that they will need to survive.
But we expect to get richer. Growth promises a better tomorrow. We all, the trade unionists, the politician, the businessman, all expect growth. But because we expect more, we are careless with what we have. Much of it. We junk.
"70% of this tip should not be here. Here are the metals that we grow short of. Here is the oil we transformed into plastic. Here ends the forest we turned into paper."
Resources our children may need, used to wrap up our food, to pretty our shopping.
Nor has wealth solved many of our social problems. Tempted by the trivia of affluence, there's not enough money for housing or the poor. So what do we do about population? How will we control our desires to have children?
How do we change the idea that population control is for other people, usually the poor?
I don't expect that we're going to avoid collapse. I'm not sure what it will look like. I mean, and so I simply don't know. I had many different scenarios, but actually we don't know. It's not knowable, or epidemics. I mean, I don't know what it will be. But in one way or another, we are so far globally. We are so far above the population and the consumption levels which can be supported by this planet that I know in one way or another it's going to come back down. So I don't hope to avoid that. I hope that it can occur in a civil way, and I mean civil in a special way, peaceful. Peace doesn't mean that everybody's happy, but it means that conflict isn't solved through violence, through force, but rather in other ways. And so that's what I hope for. That we can, I mean, the planet can support something like 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion, depending on how much liberty and how much material consumption you want to have. If you want more liberty and more consumption, you have to have fewer people. And conversely, you can have more people. I mean, we could even have 8 or 9 billion probably if we have a very strong dictatorship, which is smart. It's, unfortunately, you never have smart dictatorships. They're always stupid. So, but if you had a smart dictatorship and a low standard of living, you can have it. But we want to have freedom and we want to have a high sentence. So we're going to have 1 billion people. And we're now at 7, so we have to get back down. I hope that this can be slow, relatively slow, and that it can be done in a way which is relatively equal, so that people share the experience and you don't have a few rich, trying to force everybody else to deal with it.
I still remember 50 years ago when I made the first public presentation of Limits to Growth. It was at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. That's me standing at the podium, a young scientist. To my right is Aurelio Pache and 2 of my team members, Jorgen Ronders and Bill Behrens. And just to the left, peeking out behind the podium, you see a bit of Donella Meadows, who was a senior member of the team and the main author of the book. I was incredibly worried about that presentation because it seemed to me that everything I had to say was totally obvious and that the people who had come together to listen would think it was a waste of time. Little did I know, A, it wasn't going to be a waste of time. B, they didn't know it. C, they didn't accept it. And C, 50 years later, I'd still be talking about the same things. We worked at 2 years at MIT, a group of 16 of us, to create a computer model to help understand the long-term causes and consequences of growth on the planet. You can't make predictions about the future, but you can show different possibilities. Next slide, please. One of our possibilities is what we might loosely term sustainable development. There we are in 1972. I'm now showing you a computer output for a 200-year period from 1900 up to 2100. Next. And as the scenario unfolded, we saw a world coming into equilibrium. It's not a utopia, but it's one which has an equitable and fairly peaceful existence. Unfortunately, our model showed us other options. Next. If we didn't take the actions necessary to slow growth, a different result would happen. Next. This one, growth has continued up until just about now. Next. Please, next. You see the scenario, many people have gone back more recently to try and understand how accurate we were. One interesting example, Graham Turner from the National Research Institute in Australia concluded that, unfortunately, this scenario is the one that's most likely to explain the recent history. Next. Here you are, you see in 2022, where a number of the major parameters start to trend down. Next. So to put this in a slightly different way, in 1972, we had 2 options. Next. One of them was to start altering the forces that promote population and industrial growth and to stabilize the system under the carrying capacity of the planet. Next. If we ignored that, and then growth would continue for quite some time. Next. And it did. Now here we are in 2022. The options we have are different. Next. We can, if we, and this is, for example, the subject of the COP meeting recently, if we begin making really drastic changes, we can reverse the growth pressures and try to bring the system back down under the capacity which can be supported by the planet. Next. If we ignore that and try to sustain growth, we'll overstress the system until finally collapse is almost inevitable. So here we are, next. 50 years later, next. We need to change from slowing down, which was the task we had back in the early 70s, to getting back down, which is the priorities that realistically confront us now. Easy to say that in theory, but of course, when you start to look at the practicality, it involves an enormous number of different issues. All of them have what I call the characteristic of being difficult problems. I'll explain that with a simple graph. Next. Difficult problems are ones where you see yourself at some level on the left, that little black dot, and you want to achieve more progress, move up to that black dot on the right. There are generically two ways to take action. Next. The first one makes the perceived achievements look much better over the short term, but ultimately lay the foundations for failure over the long term. Another set of options, next, make things look worse in the short term, but actually get you where you want to go. The dilemma we confront in our society is that most of the evaluation methods and institutions that we have, political, economic, administrative, psychological, judge their progress too soon. Next. Typically, the next election occurs when the bad choice still looks attractive. And without getting into a lot of detail, this curve explains the difficulties we have now in energy, with the climate, with the soil erosion, food production, and so forth. Take energy as a very simple example. The best way to solve energy problems in an industrialized society is to make it more expensive and more difficult to get in the short term so that people begin to adapt. But politicians who advocate that would very seldom get reelected. So instead, they subsidize energy, for example, by trying to cap the price that people will pay. And so we go. It's the same with climate. The things we really need to do to solve the climate crisis are going to make most of our indicators, like economic welfare, look worse in the short term. This is important because, next, if we don't solve these problems, we can expect to see growing chaos. Next. You can imagine the number and severity of problems leads to the amount of chaos. Next. That, unfortunately, in our political and economic system, tends to focus our leaders' attention on the short term. So as chaos goes up, the emphasis on the short term goes up. Next. With difficult problems, as you look more and more at the short term, your ability to find fundamental solutions goes down. And as the ability to solve problems goes down, next, of course, the amount of chaos goes up. This is what we in systems call a self-reinforcing positive loop. You call it in German Teufel or Regelkreise. It's even worse than this because as the amount of chaos goes up, next, there's a very strong incentive in our political system to centralize decision-making. You see that actually unfolding now in many of the major countries around the world. And as a centralized decision-making increases, next, the influence of diversity and scientific understanding on decision-making goes down, unfortunately. Next, with that, of course, the ability to solve problems goes down. If you look at the trends in politics these days, you don't have to go back to the Communist Manifesto or to early Greek examples of tyranny. It's simply explained by these simple feedback loops. And of course, our challenge is going to be how to deal with these problems while avoiding getting into these self-reinforcing cycles. So let's take a concrete look at Germany, for example, next. What are some of the future challenges for Germany? Well, of course, far be it from me in the few minutes I have to imagine providing a long list, but I put down a few just to remind you of next. Next, please. So, of course, as we're reminded by the most recent COP meeting, climate change is no longer a theoretical possibility. It's underway at the moment. And for Germany, this is going to have a number of really interesting issues. Sea level rise is not one, of course, by and large, but the rise in the sea, which we can foresee with absolute certainty between now and 50, is going to increase the number of refugees by a factor of 4. So if you think about the problems which you're having now, coping also here in the United States with people who want to move across the borders, you can imagine that it's going to become much more intense. We've tailored an agricultural system to be maximized under the current climate regime, and as that changes, it's going to impact on food production. Also, as you're seeing in Germany, where water transport is a major importance to your economy, it's going to start to disrupt transport. These are not short-term temporary phenomena. These are trends which are going to exist throughout the lifetime of everyone sitting in this audience and your children too. Resources are being depleted, of course. You notice that with your reliance on fossil energy. And as that happens, we're going to be forced to reduce use of energy and water. It's a good thing in one way that population is aging, that it brings with it a number of interesting concerns that will challenge Germany. Your workforce is going to start declining. That has implications for the gross output. It changes patterns of production and consumption. An elderly population needs a different mix of goods and services than a younger one. And changes in policies of Social Security, the old more or less Ponzi scheme based on the fact that you have a lot of workers supporting a few people is going to change. So how do we prepare for these? Next, please. How do you prepare for these challenges? Next. Well, absolutely the first thing to do is to shift the emphasis. We have to quit focusing on sustainable development and start to see how we can increase resilience. What do I mean by that? Next. If you look at the way sustainable development is discussed, it really means effectively raising the welfare of the poor with, however, the rich not having to give up very much. This was maybe possible back in the 70s. It's not possible now. 8 billion people is far above the carrying capacity of the planet, whose resources are deteriorating now already without most of those people having anywhere near the demand on resources that we have in the industrialized West. Shocks are coming. We can't understand precisely where or how large, so we need to increase our ability to cope with them by increasing resilience. Next. That means improving the capacity at all levels of society to adapt to unexpected shocks. You can do this at the level of the individual, family, the household, the firm, etc. And lessons you learn at one level can be useful at another. Now, I've spoken theoretically. I apologize. I'm trying to summarize 50 years of learning in 15 minutes, which is, of course, quite a challenge. But I will leave you with one specific concrete action I think you could take that would be very helpful. Germany and other industrialized countries spend millions to understand how to sustain growth. If you could allocate a tenth of 1% of that amount to a little research institute someplace which begins to think through the challenges not of growth, but of decline, you would begin to understand ways that that can be done which are equitable, peaceful, and under control. The point that Herman was making was that when the world is empty and it has plenty of places to give you stuff and to stick your stuff after you're finished with it, you don't have to attribute any cost to that. Then efficiency is a simple calculation of what you buy compared with what you sell. Now the world is full, and when we emit CO2 or when we extract fossil fuels, there are costs there which, as you point out, George, are not included in the traditional economic framework. I concluded my remarks by pointing out that we spend billions trying to understand how to grow. I would ask the state secretary, how much money does Germany spend trying to understand the rational policy measures which are appropriate for a declining workforce or for bringing energy consumption down in an equitable way, or for dealing with the kind of shifts that are going to have to take place in agricultural production as climate changes. The traditional economic system doesn't lead us to invest money in those kinds of questions, and now it's time that we do that. Technology doesn't exist independently of the goals and the constraints of the people who develop it. It's the incentives of the military, the industrial, the governmental factors that have been creating technology in the past, which have led us into our current predicament, and expecting that now those same decision makers are going to develop a technology that automatically solves the problems which they created in the first place has, in my mind, no realistic basis. But I think it's important to understand we have today in operation around the world the technologies that would be required to solve the current problems. The reason those problems persist is not because we don't have the technology, it's because we don't have the will or the ethics or the norms to use them. Hunger isn't caused globally by lack of technology, and new technology is not going to solve hunger. Nor, incidentally, is solar energy going to solve the energy problem. I don't want to be impolite, but this notion that the sun is giving us infinite energy is just a fantasy. The ocean gives us infinite water, but that doesn't mean that nobody has problems with drinking water availability. The constraints on capital, as was pointed out, are more than enough to mean that energy is going to be a persistent problem in the future. So fine to develop new technologies, go for it, but don't imagine that that's going to eliminate the need for us to sit back and look at the incentives we have to sustain growth and use growth as a way of dealing with problems. That's not going to work in the future. One fact about climate change that we need to keep in mind is that the greenhouse gases already emitted over the last 100 years will be the major influence on climate over the next several decades. The policies which we're discussing now, the goals that we've set for ourselves, even if we're enormously successful, will only start to be seen, the positive consequences seen decades from now. So we've set ourselves up for a climate that's going to continue to change and produce surprises. That's why I've shifted from sustainability to resilience. I don't know what kinds of shocks are coming, but I know that the climate is going to give us a number of them. And although the COP efforts are absolutely worthwhile because finally, we do need to bring these things under control. They aren't going to make our short-term problems any smaller. That's where we need to focus. I thought about his question. Why is it that all of these crises are seemingly coming at the same time? I know it's hard to keep a perspective. 10 or 15 years ago, if I had told you that over the next decades, we will see simultaneously a global epidemic, which kills many, many millions of people. We'll see another land war. We'll see floods, which essentially destroy an entire country. We'll start to see interruptions in the food supply system. 20 years ago, these things seemed to be very distant and almost impossible. And now, if you pick up the paper, you see that they're happening all at the same time. That's one of the attributes of our standard approach. We try to solve a problem by taking resources from other sectors and by imposing costs on other sectors, and then that makes it better where we are. In an empty world, you can do that, but now we're in a world where all the sectors are at their capacity, and if you take resources from one, it simply causes problems there. So that's what's going on these days. The crucial thing to recognize, and I think there's a point made by Rockstrom, this isn't a temporary phenomenon. It's not as though things are going to go back to quote normal. It's not going to be like it was in the 90s ever again. And so as companies and governments start to look ahead, they need to count on a very different set of circumstances. Let me say, conclude, that's why shifting the focus from sustainable development over to resilience